Hello, my name is Amber, and this is the You Look Like a Badger podcast, a monthly podcast where I discuss queer cinema. On this season of the podcast, I am discussing films that have incurred some kind of controversy around them, and every April, I look at films that are made for young people, so teenagers or children, and the title I kind of give this month is Won't Somebody Please Think of the Children? I think it just kind of encapsulates the feeling people have towards queer media made for kids. In the case of today's film, I'm looking at quite a popular one that was quoted to be the first mainstream gay rom-com for a teenage audience. Today's film is Love, Simon.
Sometimes I feel like I'm stuck on a Ferris wheel. One minute I'm on top of the world and the next I'm at rock bottom. Over and over all day long because a lot of my life is great, but nobody knows I'm gay.
Love, Simon is a romantic comedy drama based on the YA novel of the same name that follows Simon Spear as he navigates high school whilst harbouring a secret. He's gay and being blackmailed into manipulating his friends. The film makes specific use of technology in how it affects coming out, as well as incorporating tropes from teen rom-coms of the past. Whilst flawed in its approach and depiction of queerness at the time, this film was lauded as being the first baby steps into introducing queer cinema to a teenage audience. As the years have gone on, some critics have pointed out the ways in which the film seeks to flatten out and strip its content of queerness, choosing instead to appeal to heteronormative sensibilities, particularly when it comes to the film's main romantic plot. This film was very heavily praised, received many nominations, and won a significant amount of those awards it was nominated for, including the GLAAD Media Award for Outstanding Wide Release, the Best Musical Moment at MTV Movie and TV Awards, the Choice Movie at the Teen Choice Awards, and its lead actor, Nick Robinson, won the Ally for Equality Award at the Human Rights Campaign and the Choice Breakout Movie Star at the Teen Choice Awards. This film has a 92% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes and an 88% audience score and a 3.4 on Letterboxd. I'm aware that from all of that, it might seem surprising that this did have any controversy around it, but I do remember when it came out and the kind of discourse following its release. So please don't be fooled by how well liked it seems to have been, because there are plenty of issues that people have with this film, many of which have been made in good faith, which I will get into. But let's read some of the most popular reviews on Letterboxd. This first one is from the user Brat, and they say, things Love, Simon got correct about gay culture. Iced coffee, musical theatre, watching Panic at the Disco videos on YouTube in middle school. Incorrect about gay culture. Simon's ability to drive. Just as a stereotype, we need to put this to bed. I know, many gay people that can drive. Some of them even drive trucks. So this stereotype is baseless. I'm aware this is coming from someone who can't drive, but this next review is from the user Antonio, and they say, Simon falling in love with every boy who is remotely nice to him is peak repressed gay representation. I mean, it's just true, and it's one of the things I found most endearing about the film. I think there are so many things about it that just speak to being a teenager in general, but like specifically for queer people, just searching for like any ounce of it around you anywhere. Just very endearing, I think. And this last review is from user Kai, and they said, I just realised this must be how straight people feel when they watch rom-coms. And I liked this review because I am in a bit gonna be slightly harsh on this film, and I think it's warranted. I think that there are issues that I have, but I will say that I know that it's an important film for people, and when I watched it, I think I watched it in the cinema. It did like speak to something in me, at least at the time when I saw it. I think I was like 20 years old, so I wasn't a teenager anymore when I first watched it. But there was just so much that felt quite honest about it. And I think, look, it is not perfect. It's a first draft of what a gay rom-com could be, but I don't hate this film. So, and I don't think that's like a spoiler. I don't have it in me to hate it. There are things that I don't like, but I don't hate the film. I think I should just like jump in to analysis. So I'm going to give a spoiler warning. If you haven't seen the film and it's a film that you'd like to watch, then this is your warning to stop the podcast and go and watch it. I know for a fact that it's on Disney Plus right now. If you feel like sailing the high seas and putting a little skull and crossbone flag up, then I won't blame you if you choose to watch the film completely legally. Wink, wink. That's not my place to judge. Whatever way you choose to watch the film, if it's a film that you'd want to watch, now is your time to go and do it. I'll give you some space to go do that, and then you can come back and listen to me be a grumpy little bitch about it.
I don't care if you didn't think that my coming out was going to be a big thing, Martin. Look, you don't get to decide that. I'm supposed to be the one that decides when and where and how and who knows and how I get to say it. That's supposed to be my thing. And you took that away from me.
When talking about this film, lots and lots and lots of people bring up the fact that this film was the first mainstream teen comedy foregrounding a gay character. So many different publications started with that, and it's important to like let that fact really hit you, because this film came out in 2018. In my episode for the Mitchells versus the Machines, I talked about the various different factors that have led to there being very little queer media for children and teenagers. If you want to listen to the more historical context for that, then I'd recommend going to listen to that episode. Whilst we have that, and I think it's a great achievement, we have to be a bit careful in how we are framing it, because I think on the one hand, you want this to be like a win for gay people, that teenagers can see themselves on screen. At the same time, I think we have to acknowledge the extent that queerness, and in this case specifically white, gay, cis men, have become a viable demographic to sell movie tickets to. I'm not saying that queer people of all backgrounds couldn't watch this film and get something significant from it. I did talk about how I had, quite an emotional experience with it when I watched it the first time, and I'm not a cis gay man. The extent that queerness has become marketable needs to be acknowledged when we say stuff like the first mainstream teen comedy, because mainstream means that this is a film that straight people are going to be comfortable watching. Like John Waters and Derek Jarman and Rose Troche and, various queer directors that very specifically don't make films for teenagers, but they do make films for queer adults, have struggled to find mainstream footing specifically because of that, right? So I just want to frame the analysis around the marketability of LGBT identities and how this has informed the story that is being told, and how this informs coming out, because many mainstream gay stories revolve around coming out and interacting with heteronormativity, the ways that it pushes up against it, and the ways that it's very specifically trying to appear as normal as possible. So not pushing boundaries or scaring off straight people, but presenting a palatable story. And I think what a lot of straight people know about queer people can be very little, but what they do know is the extent that they interact with queerness. The most likely interaction they're going to have with queer people is through them coming out, because coming out is the first time usually that they have to view a person as different than what they assumed. If the assumption is that people are straight, then that realization is the entry point for heterosexuality, right? Which is why I think a lot of stories about gay people aimed at straight people revolve around the first time they have to acknowledge queerness, which is when queer people come out. It's not a bad idea to have a coming of age story for a gay character be their coming out, because a lot of coming of age stories are about maturing into what is going to be the final version of yourself. Love, Simon is framed around Simon coming into his identity. I think we should start with the representation of technology in the film, because representing the internet and smartphones in movies, it's going to go one of two ways. It's going to be bearable or incredibly cringe. I would argue that this film deals with it relatively well. I would say a smidge outdated, at least for 2018, but having the characters, talk on FaceTime and use message boards and talk over email, it's close enough to understand the modern queer teen experience. It's in the area of correct, even if it's just slightly off. This is a film about gay teenagers, and Tumblr isn't mentioned even once. Simon connects with Blue, his anonymous gay love interest, using email. In fact, the first time that he comes out to somebody is to Blue over email. It's actually revealed that the opening narration that people have criticized, because Simon says the phrase, "I'm just like everybody else, I'm just very, very normal, except for I'm gay." I can see how out of context that seems like Simon trying to distance himself from being gay, but I think when you put it in the context of an email, right, and it's not just the narration of Simon trying to convince the audience to keep watching the film. When you frame it within the email, I think it sounds like a gay teenager trying to convince this person that he doesn't know that he's someone who's safe to talk to. And I think it's quite interesting that it did that. I do have issues with the way that Simon's kind of internalized homophobia isn't addressed, and I will talk about that later, but I think in this specific case, I've heard criticism that a lot of the film feels like Simon trying to assimilate and appeal to heteronormativity, and I can agree with it to an extent, but in this specific instance, it feels more like someone who is not ready to face the fact that he may be perceived as abnormal to some people, and how painful that feels. I also think it's really interesting how technology is framed as a means for queer connection, and the vice principal of the school is very anti-phone. The film makes a big deal of having their head teacher stand in the hallway and be like, "Stop being on your phones, look at the world." I just think about how much time I spent not in the world and on my phone, on YouTube or Tumblr or AO3, just looking for queerness because there was none in my life. So I think that was really interesting, and it kind of endeared me to the film in terms of technology as well. I read this article in Into Film that was talking about the way the film chooses to represent being gay in the smaller moments, and how those feel very significant if you're looking out for them. And we could be cynical in that the film chooses to minimize that for the sake of not alienating people, and I'd probably agree with you, But I do think it's like important to acknowledge that a lot of gay people have probably had to make themselves smaller so that people don't know before they're ready to be told. So I'm going to read this quote. Many of the most touching moments of Simon's experience are small but perceptively handled. Struggling to even anonymously write the words "I'm gay" in an email to somebody he already knows his secret, finding it difficult to talk about men he finds attractive, or wrestling internally with whether an individual he has a crush on is gay or straight. I've been very kind so far. We're about to get not very kind. And we're going to talk about Martin. I wasn't able to find that much written about Martin, but he is framed in such a specific way that I wanted to discuss. So, by all accounts, the film wants us to view Martin as cringe. There is no other word for it. He is cringe. He wears shirts with slogans on them, and he can't read social cues, and he's really into magic, and he does random public romantic gestures that are not wanted. And all of this is alongside the fact that he's blackmailing Simon into manipulating his friends so that he can ask out his friend Abby. Why isn't Martin's blackmail enough of a reason to dislike him? Why would we also have to have him be like embarrassing? He wears a dress on Halloween and Simon makes fun of it. By all accounts, in terms of the story, Martin is the queer one. Simon is trying with all his might to appear as straight. He does all the straight things, and he's convincing the audience and he's convincing everybody else that he is heterosexual. Martin exists as an antagonist not simply because he's doing a very awful thing to this queer teenager, but he must also be an aberration in how he dresses and how he acts. In a different movie, I feel like Simon would be the bully and Martin would be the gay teenager. It's interesting to characterize Martin this way. It feels like they were trying to deconstruct a specific kind of masculinity, and I'm not saying that that's wrong. I think there is a type of misogyny that comes with nerdy men. Many have referred to Nick Robinson as like a jock character. He's like masculine, and a lot of people have said that he's very unconvincing as a gay person. When you have this queerness that doesn't appear as having any like real consequences for it, so beyond the fact that Simon is gay, the film frames it in a way that even if he came out, not much would change for him. As for Martin, fundamentally who he is not only this person who's doing this horrific thing, but he's like a prime target for bullying, right? Because in the real world, who do you think would be receiving the bullying? I don't feel like it would be Simon, which is not to say that you can't be gay and also conform, but I think the way that the film tries to distance itself from weirdness, it's the only word I can think of to describe it, is a testament to the ways that this is a piece of work that's trying to assimilate rather than distance itself or acknowledge the distance between queerness and heteronormativity. Another scene that we should definitely talk about, and I think this kind of feeds on from the distancing from queerness, is that we have this like sequence where Simon is describing why coming out is unfair and how it'll be a lot easier in college just to be gay. And there is a straight coming out scene where all the straight characters come out to their parents as straight, and it is funny. I did laugh even the second time that I watched it, but what follows is a sequence where, and this is a very heavily criticised scene as well, Simon fantasizes about being in college and he's got all these like posters of various pop stars on his wall, and he does like a little dance to "I Want to Dance with Somebody" by Whitney Houston. And at the end of this fantasy, he goes, yeah, well, I'm not going to be that gay. And again, I want to hold like space for Simon dealing with internalized homophobia. And I am happy for a film to not have to like push me to realize that's what's happening. If a character is feeling shame around their identity, I'm okay for that to be shown on screen. What I don't like is that this insecurity and the damage that it has to other queer people or anyone who just is atypical, this like constant distancing, as if the film is pleading with its straight audience to keep watching, because I promise you it's not going to be like that kind of gay movie. Everyone is very, very much normal. They just, some of them like to lightly peck men on the face, and then that's it. They don't do anything else. Don't worry, none of the teenagers are having sex, all right? None of them at all. That distancing and that unwillingness to acknowledge that's what's happening is a problem. Like, Simon is actively hostile to an effeminate gay man in his school, and without acknowledging that on screen, without there being like a legitimate conversation about that, you reinforce solidified ideas about effeminate men or femininity, just like queerness. There are like so many queer conservatives, like more than you'd want them to be, that argue like, yes, I'm attracted to people of the same gender. Yes, of course I hate myself because of this. I want to be just like you, but this is the way I was born. I can't change that. That kind of rhetoric, that kind of ideology feeds into the idea that to be a gay person is to live with a kind of hatred, if not of yourself, then of other queer people who are stopping you from being normal. And I think when you don't acknowledge this in a film for queer teenagers, you kind of teach them to hate other queer people. This like sanding down of the queer experience is a lie, one. And if it's not a lie, it's denial. If it's not denial, then it's actively exclusionary. So yeah, I had some issues with the way that queerness is presented. I think particularly because in centering the coming out, it wants to be a film that's like one and done. Like once you come out, that's like the end of gay stuff. That's all you have to do. You come out and then you're done. That's the end of it. And like presenting it as that uncomplicated is a trope of the teen movie. We have simple solutions for the runtime that is meant to be like fluff, and you just meant to watch it and enjoy it and then not really think too deeply about it. But this is a film podcast, so I don't think you should expect anything less from me. But when we're like talking about teen films, I think another aspect of this like goal of assimilation is using the tropes from the movies that we know and love, such as the romantic gesture that is very public. So we think of like 10 Things I Hate About You, right? Got Heath Ledger and he's singing on the bleachers and he's making a big fool of himself for Julia Stiles' character, just to prove that he really, really, really does want to ask her to the prom, right? See, that works for straight characters because within the film, Kat is only queer in that she has feminist ideals and is a bit angry. She is, by all accounts, heterosexual, and that's acknowledged in the film. So this public gesture works because a man professing his desire for a woman in public, whilst it is a bit, cheesy, it's not gonna get anyone hate crimed, right? In this film, we have two main romantic gestures, and I think it is interesting that it seeks to demystify the romantic gesture and like bring it to a more grounded place. So with Martin, he chooses to publicly ask out Abby despite these feelings not really being reciprocated, and he does this using a microphone, and she very politely rejects him, but this is done in front of the whole school. In that sense, it is taking the romantic gesture and kind of acknowledging that without consent, It feels more like an ultimatum. And it is interesting that the film tries to present Simon's public romantic gesture of the Ferris wheel at the end of the film as more wholesome and with less stakes attached. So it goes that Blue has the option to come to the Ferris wheel and reveal himself if that's the choice that he wants to make. And adding the aspect of choice for Blue is good, I think, but there is a layer of having to out oneself to not just that person, but to the whole school in order to not lose this connection. And that feels a bit icky, just a smidge. To an extent, I understand the adjustment that was made. I think the idea of getting the whole school involved as like a liberatory experience for Simon is great and all, but it kind of puts Blue, I'm gonna keep calling him Blue even though his name is Bram in the film, in an awkward position because either he has to come out in front of the whole school and face the consequences of that, or he chooses to not turn up and loses this connection with another queer person. The film complicates it a bit in that Simon is left alone after being outed because his straight friends are the worst. We'll get onto that in a second. This is kind of a problem with the whole film. I don't know that the film acknowledges the experiences of queer people outside of Simon. That is like a big issue with the film, especially when said film is meant to be a romance and we don't quite understand the other party. I think the fact that Blue is a mystery for most of the film is a problem when we are meant to be rooting for that romantic endgame, right? We don't know anything about Blue. We only know Simon's interpretation of him. So all in all, the romance feels like it's simply ticking a box for Simon's coming out journey. So not only has he come out to his parents and his friends and been accepted, he also gets a love interest because that's what gay people do. So I read an article about the film in the New Yorker, which made the argument that the real romance is actually between Simon and his public identity, and that his coming out is a lot more important than his actual desire to be in a relationship, be with men. I can somewhat understand that, but the problem with that is that you almost question why the romance was in there at all. I honestly found the romance the most secondary part of the film, but the article went on to say that in their opinion, the kiss at the end of the film felt more like a win for representation than the climax of a crush, and that's fairly accurate. I think this film is more interested in the idea of coming out than the actual ramifications and nuances of that journey. If I rewrote this film, maybe I'd just pick a lane, either the secret gay romance where maybe Simon comes out to his friend group and nobody else, but he gets to have this really authentic teenage romance, or you cut the romance out altogether and just have it be an exploration of queerness where Simon just gets to have a lot of crushes on people, and that kind of being the journey. I think this film wants to have its coming out story but not really discuss the politics behind that, and that I think makes it a much weaker story and honestly less radical than a lot of people want to acknowledge.
Jacques, I have to get something off my chest. The other day you asked me what I was wearing for Halloween, and I said I wasn't dressing up. I lied. Truth is, I didn't want you to know what I was wearing because I don't want you to know who I am. Right now, these emails, they feel like this totally safe place. I'm just not ready for my whole world to change. I hope you understand.
Yes, Blue. I understand.
I have discussed in the previous section, the extent that Simon wants to appear as normal. And in that New Yorker article that I was talking about before, the writer uses the term homonormativity, and they define it as constantly assuaging the young audience's anxiety about gayness manifesting in cliched difference. The film sets up that Simon is, by all accounts, a completely normal teenager. He comes from like a rich family. His parents bought him a car. He does things like watching movies and drinking coffee. He's just like you. He does like the teen movie sitcom thing where he walks down to get breakfast in the morning, takes a singular bite, and then walks out of the house to go to school. He even has liberal parents who are cool with him coming home drunk. He lives a relatively progressive life where he's well off and he has no kind of external factors that would contribute to him being not normal, except for the gay. So CBC Arts says of the film, Simon is essentially so devoid of any expressions of queerness that he might as well be the poster boy for how straight people have historically tended to want gay people to be, just like them. In order for the film to be just like its straight audience, it also has to distance itself from queerness and participate in homophobia and femme-shaming in the way that straight people would. As Rowan Ellis put in her video about this film, it employs the heterosexual gaze and it never asks its audience to examine the extent that they're complicit in the homophobia that Simon expresses. They're never made to question their initial reaction to queerness that doesn't fit into the gender binary they recognise. With all this in our brains, the film almost invites us to question how our story should be told. And I think this has in fact translated into the real world. And I want to just take some time to kind of look at this debate and what it's doing, because on the one hand, this homonormativity exists to combat fears straight people have about queerness and how queerness will change their lives personally. But I do think that this debate around what is meant to be appealing to straight people has to an extent been co-opted by, there isn't really a word for people who only really experience queerness in online spaces. I think the closest term we have is terminally online. I think what I want to acknowledge is that whilst I'm coming at this from what I think is a good faith point of view, I know a lot of people don't. They have very totalizing views on what is and isn't good representation. And I think this story in particular is kind of a good case study for that, because a couple of years ago there was some controversy around the author of this book, who many people perceived as a straight woman, and accused her of like fetishizing the gay male experience. Now, this comes with like a lot of history of straight women's relationship with gay men, and that's a very like complicated topic, right? But when you're in online spaces, all of that gets condensed and stripped of nuance. So what manifested is Becky Albertalli, the author of Simon versus the Homo sapiens, being harassed until she had to make a statement about her own sexuality. And I'm gonna give a rundown of the events, and I'll put all the sources in the description. But I remember this happening and it kind of really changing how I approach these discussions, because this whole situation was just really shitty. And I think it's important to put it here whilst we're discussing homonormativity, and how for a lot of people I think this analysis is very theoretical and they don't have to deal with the consequences of being perceived as a straight person or being perceived as a gay person with internalized homophobia. Instead of being like a person of the human experience who has like many different layers to who they are and what their identity means to them personally, and how that is kind of stripped away in these conversations, which I think is aided by the fact that a lot of people in the LGBT community will only really experience their identities not through interactions with real life queer people, but through social media and through movies and TV, and how neither of those really offer a layered experience, and they only really ask for simplistic analysis. And I want to acknowledge that here when I discuss the events that occurred in 2020 when Becky Albertalli had to come out of the closet to stop people from harassing her. I'm going to give a rundown of those events. The hashtag Own Voices was created to highlight marginalized writers telling their own stories, so that specifically for the purpose of a more nuanced, less tropey experience of queerness, and also just people of different cultural backgrounds, just so that people who would often be written as side characters would be the main characters, and they would have complicated and nuanced subjective voices, right? Because they were written from a place of that background. Now, this hashtag was started in good faith. Unfortunately, as I've previously spoken about, online spaces don't really operate to foster good faith. They operate to foster engagement, and the best way to do that is through making you angry about stuff. So when Becky Albertalli was accused of being a straight woman who was profiting off the queer experience, she received a lot of harassment. This then forced her to write an essay for Medium where she came out as bisexual. I'm going to read some of that to you right now. This isn't how I wanted to come out. This doesn't feel good or empowering or even particularly safe. Honestly, I'm doing this because I've been scrutinized, subtweeted, mocked, lectured, and invalidated just about every single day for years, and I'm exhausted. And if you think I'm the only closeted or semi-closeted queer author feeling this pressure, you haven't been paying attention. Imagine hundreds of people claiming to know every nuance of your sexuality just from reading your novels. Imagine trying to make space for your own uncertainty. Imagine you had a Greek chorus of internet strangers propping up your imposter syndrome at every stage of the process. She also stated in the essay that she didn't meet an openly bi person until she was in college, which impacted her knowledge and perception of bisexuality. It's very weird to centre, once again, all queer experience around being out. It made everything quite clear that many members of the LGBT community also centre coming out as like a vital and necessary experience, even though for a lot of people it's not even like one of the most important experiences to them. It's not an experience to me, not to get like too personal, but it's not like top of my list in like all queer experiences. Once again, it's this kind of entitlement that straight people have, that it is essential that you define your identity, that we know what it is and its parameters, and that you tell me about it. Otherwise, that you're a liar and you're deceptive and you are profiting off queer people. And it's this like conflation of massive conglomerates distilling aspects of queer identity that they can make money off, and queer creators who are talking about their queerness in like nuanced and nebulous terms, maybe because they don't have the language to talk about it in concrete terms, maybe because they don't want to talk about it in concrete terms. But I think, in my opinion, the work of closeted people is incredibly interesting and often quite articulate. I haven't read the book of this film, so I don't know the extent that it's true to what we see on screen, but all I ask from a story really is that it's coming from an honest place. And I think, again, whilst I have problems with the film version of the story, there are parts of it that feel very honest, and the homonormativity and internalized homophobia, whilst I don't like them in the film, they do feel quite honest, actually. And maybe that's what makes the film interesting to talk about, because it's not the romance. It's a strange phenomenon that often the most quote-unquote wholesome queer media gets the most hateful fans behind it. I just don't understand wasting this much energy over Love Simon. Over the... it feels odd.
Why did you tell Nick that I have a boyfriend in college named Jonathan? Why'd you make that up?
Look, Martin, he was the one who wrote that Creek Secrets post about me. He screenshotted my emails, and he's been using them to blackmail me for months. What does that have to do with us, Simon? He told me that if I didn't help him get with Abby, he'd out me. And that's why I had to keep you guys apart.
So you made up a bunch of lies.
And that's why you convinced me to go on that date with Leah? You're gonna keep me away from Abby?
So wait, running lines at Waffle House and beer pong at Bram's, all of that was just to pawn me off on Martin? I'm not a piece of meat, Simon. You know how hard it was for me to start over. I trusted you.
I can't end this podcast without talking about the worst characters in this film. And they are even worse than Martin. And that's, quite a feat because Martin is meant to be the actual villain. But, I've talked about how I can find the humanity in Martin, actually. What I absolutely despise are Simon's friends. They are the worst. They're so fucking terrible. I hate them so much. Simon spends this entire movie juggling his identity, trying to keep his secret, trying to maintain his friendships. He spends a lot of the film matchmaking his friends and dealing with their straight bullshit and it never being reciprocated back. He is the emotional support friend who is blackmailed into manipulating his friends. And when this is revealed, they offer no sympathy. They don't even acknowledge how hard it must be for him. Instead, he has to apologize to them. Why would you put this in this movie and then not have them all be hit by a bus? Oh my god. That Rowan Ellis video that I talked about discusses how Simon's redemption in the film, because yes, he does lie about his friends, and that's not a good thing to do, but his redemption is not down to a character flaw that he has, but is down to him being outed. That's what he has to redeem himself from. He is outed and then has to apologize to his friends and make it up to them. And nobody acknowledges how fucked up that is. The whole film works to invalidate all the fears that he had about coming out by making them baseless, by offering no evidence, because everyone immediately accepts him. He has some bullying at school, but that's dealt with incredibly swiftly. The character development in the film revolves around Simon realizing that he didn't have anything to worry about. And this makes me just very angry. I have talked about how coming out stories can often center straight people's reactions to them. But not just that. I think often coming out stories work to make the queer person in the situation look silly for holding those fears. And now that just really does not sit well with me. And I think the fact that the film takes its straight characters' sides, it makes me quite angry. I don't like it. That was the shortest section, but I did have to rant about his friends because they were quite annoying. It's time to ask the question, does this film look like a badger? Kind of. It's not a good answer. I think it's fine and I don't hate it, but it's not one of my favourites. I think the film is well-meaning, but it ultimately fails to create a good love story, even if that love story is meant between Simon and his queer identity. The film doesn't have his friends apologise to him for being the absolute worst. The main love interest doesn't really feel like a character. It feels more like a prop for Simon to use as a means of queer exploration. And I mean, this is just a me thing. It feels a bit too long. There are some films that feel like they should be 90 minutes, and this wasn't that for some reason. I think the fact that it's the first mainstream teen rom-com, it's a decent first draft. I think we could get some more in there, I think. But I'm going to give you some recommendations because I don't like leaving you empty-handed. So the first media I'm going to recommend is a film that came out last year, I think. It's a film called Potato Dreams of America, and it's a comedy film split in two halves, one set in Russia, the other set in America. Both revolve around queer identity in these settings, whilst also exploring the main character's relationship with his mother. So it focuses on a young boy who begins his life in Russia and then emigrates to America with his mother, and how queerness functions within these two environments, and whether there's actually a difference between them. The second film that I'm going to recommend is Dating Amber, which is a film that I liked a lot more than Love, Simon, and that I think does the comedy aspect of it better, and it also does the coming out aspect of it better as well. So it's a film that revolves around fake dating, tried and tested romantic comedy trope. It's about two gay teenagers who pretend to be a straight couple to stop people from bullying them, and they enjoy the very limited queer experience available to them in Ireland in the 1990s. It's a film that's like legitimately funny, but holds space for the more complicated aspects of gender and sexuality, whilst, you know, not being like too hard-hitting and depressing, which can be like a fine line to tread, but I think the film does it quite well. Right, that's it then. That's all I've got for you. Thank you very much for listening. I should be doing my next episode in May on queer crime movies. If you'd like to stay updated, please make sure you follow me on Twitter @likeabadgepod. Follow me on Spotify and YouTube and TikTok for full episodes and teasers. If you'd like to see more of my work, you can find my writing at ambercanwalk.com. And if you'd like to tip me, then you can donate to my coffee, which I'll put in the description. All of my sources are also in the description. Thank you again for listening, and I hope to see you in May. Goodbye!